You want to grab the door, please? Well, let's get started. Welcome. Today we have a man who needs no introduction, Mike Alexeev from IU Econ, and he has begged for 7 or 8 minutes, 2 or 3 more minutes than usual. So, Michael.
I never beg. So, all right. Anyway, so this paper is on institutional quality and the performance of manufacturing sectors in Russia. I want to warn everybody that this is still a work in progress. So I welcome comments and also so there are still some issues, obviously. So the basic motivation for this paper, or besides just the usual one to advance or the literature a little bit, is that so the Russian economy is very much reliant on oil, and the Russian government has been trying to diversify, or at least it has claimed to be trying to diversify away from oil and natural gas, and it has not been able to do that. It is somewhat strange because Russia has a lot of human capital, so a lot of other natural resources, and so a lot of physical capital too. But it basically has had, I would say, an increasing reliance on oil, even though it's difficult to calculate that. And its performance of its more or less sophisticated manufacturing has not done well. So the question is why it is happening, and one answer, of course, is that it may be because of weak institutions. So Russia indeed has weak institutions. I have some numbers here from the world governance indicators that show that, it's indicators on the rule of law and regulatory quality and corruption control, so are all negative. It's of course, so these indicators are normally distributed around 0 with standard deviation of 1. So basically, and Russia has been relatively stagnant so between 2005 and 2016. But it's difficult, of course, to do anything with 10 years, so 10 years worth of data for a given country. But Russia has a bunch of regions, and those regions exhibit a fairly wide variation of institutional quality. So what is institutional quality, as Dean asked me earlier, so I'll talk about it a little bit later. So we use the fairly common indicator of institutional quality of Russian regions to show that the manufacturing sectors that are particularly dependent on institutional quality tend to be bigger and grow faster in the regions with better institutional quality. And so if you believe those results, then of course it can explain, so combined with the weak institutional quality in the country as a whole, it can explain why the country has not been able to diversify away from oil. How do we measure institutional dependence of manufacturing sectors? Well, there are 2 basic approaches, and one is relationship specificity. So it basically, there are more than 2, but 2 are most common, I would say. So first is relationship specificity. Basically, it calculates the share of inputs of a sector that are not traded on organized exchanges and are not reference priced. All right, so it's the kinds of inputs that need to be or negotiated over. So, and the normalized Hirschman index of inputs So this is actually the opposite of institutional dependence. The greater this index is, the less institutional dependence is, because this index obviously demonstrates the variety of inputs used. So these are some examples of manufacturing sectors. The lowest relationship specificity is for refined petroleum products, and the highest is for transport equipment. So interestingly, these two indicators, they are obviously correlated, but not very highly correlated. So it's 0.57 with a minus because HHI is opposite. So I'll skip for now maybe over the existing literature. I'll just say that this kind of estimates have been done for across country, none. So and Levchenko did that, and for provinces in China and even for states in India, but none of those papers used the panel structure explicitly. And so our main contribution here is, besides using the Russian data and all that, is to use explicitly the panel structure, which allows for doing things that cross-sectional regressions do not. So the dependent variables are basically the log of industrial output for each sector, and and the growth rate. So there are a bunch of regions and 13 manufacturing industries for which we have had consistent data, and so the independent variables are mostly the interactions between the institutional dependence of a manufacturing sector and and institutional quality of the region, as well as skill intensity of the sector and capital intensity of the sector, with respectively the human capital endowment and physical capital endowment. And so we estimate this kind of equation with various fixed effects. The panel would allow only for the fixed effects where the group variable is region industry pair, all right, and the time variable, of course, is the year. But it's possible also to use different fixed effects, in which case it becomes a cross-sectional estimation. And so let me, because I am out of even the 7-minute time, so let me show you the main results. So these are panel-based, and everything is basically as it is expected to be, that the marginal effects of institutional quality over region are positive and greater for the more institutionally dependent sectors than for, say, the median. The same kind of results are for the HHI, and so here is a little busy here, but the economic significance is that one standard deviation improvement in the institutional quality of a region would lead to 8% increase in the median in the sector with median institutional dependence, and 20% increase in the sector with the highest institutional dependence. So I'm out of time, basically. Just let me finish answering Dean's question. The institutional quality of a region here, we use the indicator of investment risk in in Russia's regions. It is mostly quote-unquote expert estimates, or based on various aspects of regional institutional inequality, and it's the only indicator which is available for all years for which we have the data on the manufacturing sectors of the output of different manufacturing sectors in Russia. So again, it's the most commonly used indicator. It's not great, but it's basically the only thing that we have. If you look at the institutional quality indicators, either for countries or for Chinese provinces, it's basically also it's not great quality data. So thank you.
So we have Q, Jimmy's first, then Chuck, and just keep raising your hand.
So Michael, I was wondering, go back to institutional quality.
Of what?
So
Institutional quality of regions.
Yeah, regions.
Okay.
So, I know nothing about Russia, but you do. So, if you were to go to the region that had the highest and the region that had the lowest index or whatever,
Yeah.
what would you notice the differences? Are there
I think
aspects
so.
that
Yes.
you would
Oh
know?
yes. Oh yes. It's a very large variance. It's not as large within, over time. So within a given region, apparently, so it's large enough to get, some estimates in a panel, but in terms of across regions, huge variation.
And what
yes.
would you see? I mean, if you were a fly on the wall, what would you see in terms of?
Well, you can. So that index, it has a bunch of different aspects, and so they estimate, they give scores to each of those aspects. It has. So it has corruption, it has crime, it has openness of the press, so all kinds of things. So and then there is the proprietary methodology of aggregating these things. But I think that the main difference that you would see is corruption. So it would be my guess. And you would also notice, I think, great disparity in the provision of public goods. So even for regions with similar per capita incomes. But yes, there is. I mean, so Moscow is supposed to be fairly well run, while, say, about Chechnya is basically awful.
Quick follow-up, so if you remove those outliers, right, because the Chechen Republic and some republics around it that might be outliers, so...
I didn't try that. It might be a good idea to try.
Yeah, Chuck, go ahead.
Could I borrow a pen from somebody?
Not for me, because I need to keep track.
Oh, no, I have a computer. So,
You sort of answered, you began to answer my question,
Yes.
which is not much in the paper on why institutions should matter. Is it corruption? Is it capital flow?
Yes.
Is it labor? Is it what?
Yes.
Why should a region matter?
good point.
Why is it that this arbitrary mix of political, presumably political relationships? Why should that matter? I mean, I'd like to see more on that in the paper and less on GMM, because that
Yes,
I
agree. So let me answer. Yes. So this paper, it needs more. So
hypotheses.
more discussion, more description. The reason it doesn't have much is because there are at least 3 papers that do a similar thing. So a Nunn's paper, which was the first one, basically, it talks at length about all this stuff. And I think I should put more into it. I agree, but so none. It was published in a QJE. It has like, I don't know, 10 pages, or explaining why it should matter. Because basically, when you have to negotiate with your suppliers or about inputs, and it's important to get inputs from this supplier because it's not easy to turn to a different one. It matters very much how the contract enforcement and property rights protection work. But if all your inputs basically are traded on an organized exchange, you don't have to negotiate with anybody. You simply put in an order and buy it.
So, okay, fantastic. Sure. So I did sort of, that theme came through a little bit in your paper.
Yeah.
One of the things happening in the U.S. is private equity has grown enormously. I mean, it's the amount of equity raised last year, private equity was more than the New York Stock Exchange. That's negotiation, that's individual, that's not an organized exchange. The full fracking industry has been mostly driven by companies who are private, they're not public. So I'd like
It's
to
not
see
a
more.
matter of
I'd like to
private
see
and
more
public.
why the organized exchange versus negotiation matters in Russia.
No, it matters everywhere. It's not about private or public. It is about where the firm, and so this is about manufacturing firms, and so it's not about private equity or even fracking. It's strictly about manufacturing, and it matters where firms get their intermediate inputs. So if a firm, if it's a refinery, its main intermediate input by far is oil. And oil is traded on organized exchanges. So you just put in an order, you may hedge futures and all that. You don't need to negotiate about anything with anybody. So if you are making computers or transport equipment is the highest thing, you need really to get, I mean, there is a famous case, what was it, Ford, it was GM and somebody else who produced the forms.
Oh, Fisher Body.
Yeah, Fisher Body, yeah. So it was a hold-up problem which was resolved by merger. And when you have to negotiate over your intermediate inputs and you don't have readily available alternative suppliers, you are exposed, for example, to a holdup. And that's when it matters whether long-term contracts are enforceable or not. As far as regions, well, so every region, it has a different governor, it has different administration, and many regions in Russia actually have different cultures. So Vova asked about outliers. Not all ethnic republics are outliers. So some of them have actually reasonably good institutions. I'll say Tatarstan is viewed as having okay institutions, right? Dagestan is not. So in those ethnic republics have a very different history and culture too.
Yeah, we have Lee, then Or, then Tony, then Gustavo.
Okay, I think I'll keep beating this horse.
Okay.
I guess it's investment risk to whom, and this is sort of Chuck's point. You can go really far on personal relationships, and so I think what you're saying is that the parties involved have extremely high discount rates to lie, cheat, and steal. Because I don't see why you can't, you're the mafioso boss in somewhere. Everybody knows you're the most important guy in the region. It's in your interest to have economic development.
So it's a station.
You're going to steal most of
Defend
it, right?
So
it's again investment risk to whom, and why can't you can have long-term contracts with lots of personal relationships.
Yes, you can. Yes,
So
but
why does it break down here, and just as Volvo said you have outliers, I'd like to see outliers on the other side, those that have poor institutional quality as based by your measure, but have relatively, you've got a bunch of regression with a bunch of dots, right?
Yeah.
So look at those that are far away, that have very poor institutional quality, yet have way more output than they should relative to the mean, and then just the opposite. Those
Yeah.
have reasonable institutional quality
Yeah.
and have lousy, and then take those as kind of case studies to help us. The paper needs, as you said, description and
Yes.
some soul
Yes.
to understand.
Yes, it would be good to have a scatter plot. I agree. Now, I basically agree. It's possible to have enforceable long-term agreements, right, based on relationships. But if we look around the world, the countries that are running that way do not perform too well, right?
Well, the U.S. in the early part of the 19th century sure did, and that was all personal exchange.
It was not all personal.
Yeah,
No.
We didn't have modern corporations until the post-Civil War.
Yeah,
right?
but there were courts. See, so and again, it's all relative, right? It's all relative. But so even in modern U.S., most of agreements are just handshake agreements.
Right.
Yes, but they are done what is called in the shadow of the law, because the parties know if they get screwed, so there is a backup. They can go to court and they can get reasonable treatment. All right, in Russia, so again, all right, depending on the region, so some of them could go to court and some of them is basically hopeless. So yes, so personal relationships matter and all that, but if you have good investment climate only for the friends of the local mafia boss, I would submit it's not going to work out too well in terms of the region's growth. So and our startups and so setting up new firms and all that.
Or's next.
Yeah, so actually, first of all, I really like the interaction of politics and economy. My questions are kind of related to the trade side, but I think they actually build on that. And so in the table, one thing that I found interesting is that institutional quality actually have negative effect at the baseline case. So basically, when you don't have trade exposure, you actually have more institutional quality is associated with lower effects.
Well, but when you have interaction terms, you cannot really look just as
Oh no! I
just at the direct.
I just think it's kind of an addition to the story, because what you're saying here is you said, well, institutional quality, it either doesn't matter. I mean, it matters in one model, right? In one of the GMA models, but the other one it doesn't matter. In the other two, it's actually negative.
Yes.
But when you start having the exposure to trade, we actually see that it starts playing a positive. So I think that kind of maybe might add to some of that by saying, look, it's not just the politics that's it's enough, right? And you can have those mafiosos cases. So what you have is both of them, right? You have the interaction.
Sure.
And so I think like highlighting the negative part could be really cool. And another thing I was thinking of is I would be curious to see what's the baseline coefficient for the RS variable looks like in those models. Is it positive or negative? Because then again, can it help you add that interactive story, right? Because if you say, well, here's what happens when we don't meet institutional quality, we actually have a negative effect of RS, then you can actually address some of those issues.
So you mean relationship specificity? Well, the problem is that for relationship specificity as well as for HHI, so I use, and this literature uses US data, all right? I cannot calculate relationship specificity for the Russian industries, which is okay because it could be endogenous anyway. Or say none uses, the relationship specificity calculated based on 6-digit US industries for all countries, for like 130 some countries. The Russian HHI I could calculate, and it's actually So it's highly correlated with the US HHI. But I can do that only for 1 year, and I don't think it changes much from 1 year to another, which means that if I mean, it might be a good idea just as an illustration to have it, but I can't use any fixed effects, essentially.
So relative specificity basically does not vary over time.
It doesn't vary over time.
I see. Okay, so I guess I understand.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
I mean, it's still, if you don't have
Yeah,
FEs,
it might be useful just as an illustration.
because here you're basically capturing the variation. So if it doesn't vary over time and you're using FEs, what you might be capturing is actually those effects that are specific to district, right? And the way you put it is
Yes.
I mean, you know, it might be interesting instead of FEs to just have a model that has the unconstrained and has the relative specificity in addition. And then,
Yes.
because again, you can exactly say, right, some regions, so positive exposure to trade, this is not enough. We still see the negative.
But I'm not sure why you keep referring to trade.
Well, not really. I mean, the idea would be that, right, so you're looking at how institutional quality moderates this effect, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
so what I'm saying is that I would like the specificity part would be interesting to see just added there, kind of what's the baseline you are moderating.
Sure. So instead of trade, I would use institutional quality, though.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I mean, I just meant that having both, I guess, based on the interaction.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
The interaction. Okay. Yeah.
You know, Tony, and I'll put people on key.
So I fear this question might be outside of the bounds of the paper, but I'm wondering if it seems that this is a unidirectional relationship between institutional quality and output. Do you think output could also affect institutional quality?
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay.
Yes, and that's the whole, so it's a whole problem, essentially, and that's why people are looking for instruments, because of the possibility of omitted variables, although that is not a huge issue with all kinds of fixed effects, but reverse causality, it can be a problem.
Right.
And that's why, none uses legal origin as an instrument for the local contract enforcement and the property rights protection, which as we all know, it's not a great instrument. There are no great instruments, unfortunately. So here I'm using republic status and distance from Moscow, not in panel regressions, but in cross-sectional ones. And those are also much too broad to represent. And even though my instrument do satisfy over-identification tests, it's not. Say Finster et al. In China, they use the occupying powers of Chinese provinces as an instrument. Come on, it can be any, it can affect anything. So the instruments are a problem here, and one contribution here is that because we use the panel structure explicitly, we can use system GMM, which has internal instruments, right? It uses lagged values of its variables and lagged differences, and so as instruments. And that may be viewed as an improvement.
Yes, we have Gustavo, Boba, Lee, Jimmy.
Okay, so I was thinking if you can say something about some kind of cluster effects. So essentially, what happens if I have a region close to me,
Yes,
good or bad?
that's another thing I need to do, and I have not.
Which I think is very interesting, especially if you need to, because the relation specificity here is, but maybe you need to trade with people that with suppliers that are outside your region, no?
Sure.
And then you have trade costs there, so having regions with good institutional quality close to you could be an advantage.
Yes.
In some sense, it could be a disadvantage because investments are going to the other regions.
Yes, I agree.
So there are a lot of interesting things to
I have
think
not.
about.
I have not. So I should have done it. I haven't. But I'll do it as basically bring in the spatial econometrics in there.
Yep.
Sure. It should help. So I have another paper on Russian regions, and there it was. So it was more on fiscal federalism issues. So there it made no difference, including so including spatial effects. But maybe here it would, precisely because, as you said, there are relationships with suppliers, and presumably suppliers are more likely to be in close by regions. So it might be particularly important what is going on in these neighboring regions, yes.
Boba. So we had this discussion before that maybe if you have regional leaders, this leader will be interested in the long run to maintain whatever types of institution to promote production. But so in Russia it's different, right? So the main goal of the regional leader would be to remain in power, right? And so then the question is which type of institutions promotes that, right? And then also the other goal might be, so even if you don't, maintain your manufacturing sector, but you might be getting money from the federal government through proceeds and all that. So the other aspect would be how much of that they'll get, and again, right? So it might be that having corrupt institutions does not benefit you in production, but benefits you in other dimensions, and that's
sure,
rational and all that.
Sure, but presumably it would not promote the growth of your sophisticated industries. If all that you are interested in is basically about getting money from the federal government, well, you don't care about what is happening, with your institutions. So it would probably imply that.
So you can basically potentially, right? So I don't know if you want to do that. Potentially, you can test and prove or disprove whether it's the case or not, or the objective.
Well, I'm not sure how to do that. There are some measures of
like it's turnover of the
of
so
the governors.
How is that related with institutions?
So I'll look into it.
Lee.
Yeah, on Vovo's point, and then I've got another comment. You could maybe look at the vote share for Putin's party by region as a control for transfers.
Close to 100%, right? So.
No, but usually
there is variation. There is variation. But you mentioned something before about courts and contracting and purchasing inputs. The historical solution, as you mentioned, with Fisher Body was vertical integration.
Yes.
So you could have backward or forward integration. Yeah. So I don't know if you could get it, but in these regions, what you ought to see is much more. The firms should be larger.
Yes,
should be more
in the regions.
Than in regions that have higher institutional quality.
Yes,
then you can
I agree. It might be possible. To tell you the truth, I don't know if there are data on firm size by region. I'll have to look into it. But
that might help you.
It might be. It would probably be inversely correlated.
Well, at least my recollection of the old, Soviet regime was that there was one. Factory in the Czech Republic that made matches for everybody.
One problem with the Russian data in this sense is that it is often difficult to tell which firm belongs to which group. So there are Putin's cronies who have all kinds of businesses, and you really need to get into it to find out which ones are related to main the holding and which are not. But I'll look into it.
We have Jimmy next.
So Michael, one of the other earlier discussions got me thinking about, you're looking at, in essence, change in output, or growth in output.
Yes.
And would it be possible to look at what part of that is due to expansion of existing firms versus
No, I cannot.
new firms?
No.
Because that would kind of get at this.
I can.
New firms willing to take a risk.
Yeah, there are data maybe on the number of firms starting, so by region, but I would have no idea which industry they are in.
But if you took, what if I don't forget, you've got 7-year span or something.
Yes.
So can't you look at the data and look, you're 3 years in, was that firm in the data in year 1 and year 2? Can you just,
Well, no. Well, maybe. I just don't have this data. I think I know who does, but yeah.
there's a question of growth versus growth in terms of firms that are in the system.
It's
They've
true.
got these relationships versus willingness to
Yeah.
move in. So.
One huge improvement I think that could be made for this paper is to look at firm level. So here is basically it's just so the output of industry of a certain sector within the region.
Yeah, okay. All right.
But say, okay, Finster et al. For Chinese provinces, they actually looked at firm level, and I think that there are data for Russian firms too. It's just I don't have them. But again, I think I know who does, and maybe I should talk to that guy and see if we could work on another paper.
After this.
After this one. Yes.
Chuck, and then we have an empty queue after that.
Okay,
So,
well,
stop.
maybe I'll try to fill it up. So your basic
5 minutes.
the basic reason why you did this paper was diversification of the Russian economy and lack thereof, and
Yes.
mostly investing in oil and gas.
Yes.
Could it also be, have nothing to do with institutional quality, but oil and gas is just really profitable?
Yes. Yes.
And so in that regression, I might stick, I don't know, the value of Gazprom, the price of oil.
Yeah,
And the other thing that occurs to me is the sector output, that includes oil and gas, right?
It includes petroleum products and gas products. It does not include oil and gas because it's only manufacturing.
So can you subtract out the part that's
Yes.
related to, and then look at that other part and see what happens? to
Yes,
institutional
I
quality?
can. Yes, and the estimates become weaker, but it's such a big part of the Russian economy that.
Well, again, so maybe when if there's more competition for Russian oil and gas over mostly in Eastern Europe and Germany, right? You'll see a lot more development of other industries because people now are just they made so much money with oil and gas.
Yes, and there are people actually who argued and even showed that investment in oil and gas in Russia is the most profitable thing, so the returns are the highest. But the problem is that these are very volatile sectors. Again, strictly speaking, extraction of oil and gas is not part of this thing because it's mining, it's not manufacturing. And I tried to include mining, so interaction between the institutional quality and mining, and it did not change much. So oil and gas is very volatile in terms of its prices.
Right.
And just because of that, it's not a good idea for a country in general to rely to the extent that Russia does on oil and gas. Because, simply because of volatility, also oil and gas actually employ relatively few people. And I guess you can still argue, so why bother? Although they will run out of oil and gas in about 20 years or something. But the Russian government has proclaimed many times, we want to diversify away from oil and gas. And so a lot of discussion in Russia is about exactly that. and so they have the conditions. The basic human capital in Russia is actually reasonably high, especially educational one. So in terms of health aspects, no. But in terms of education, it's much higher than the Russian per capita income, average per capita income would suggest. But they still have not been able to develop sophisticated manufacturing industries.
You have Gustavo, then Lee.
So kind of, it's a related question. So from, I was thinking this discussion of diversification of the economy in Latin America happened after the Second World War, but essentially it was food stuff, it's highly specialized on food stuff, and then the whole thing is, well, all import substitution policies were essentially developed to develop these sectors in which you don't have a comparative advantage. You know? So maybe it would be interesting at the theoretical level also to connect this thing, but more important at the empirical level, it's maybe you can exploit some changes in the terms of trade in the period of time, and then some changes in tariff, no? Or trade barriers, if you had, no? Important ones, because those will be also some things that also affect the amount of resources that you want to put in one sector or the other.
There are, I see.
And then interacting this with this is, because maybe the institutional quality, what is making you is this adjustment more complicated.
But there are no trade barriers, at least no official ones, for trade between regions. It's only that way trade barriers between Russia and other countries, right?
But they will not be affected depending on what kind of stuff you have in a differential way.
Oh yeah, trade barriers could affect that, but it presumably would act in the same way on all regions, right?
On all regions. Right. Yeah.
Could I
Correct.
so say something? Actually, so this morning I thought, so there is literature on the factors that affect the regional growth in general, right? And that literature, so at least the more sort of prominent papers tend to argue that human capital is the main driver. And it would be good to see to what extent it's human capital and to what extent it is, so it is institutions. Unfortunately, so I'm not showing it here, but because I'm omitting the controls, but there in the paper, so in human capital, the variables in there are not quite. It's only in interaction, so with relationship specificity, but they are not consistently positive. So if I can somehow test, so between those two, I guess I would need to include the human capital on its own. So what I'm saying is that one interesting aspect maybe to develop it, so if possible, or it would be to see whether institutions here are more important than human capital. Of course, they are affecting each other and all that, and it might be problematic in that sense.
Lee?
Yeah, so, in the absence of institutional variation, poorer regions ought to see either capital moving in or labor moving out.
Yes, but they don't.
Yeah, so that's my question. So you can see why capital doesn't move in because institutional quality is terrible. But what you should see is that labor ought to be moving out.
Yeah.
And so one, do you see that? And two, do you have regional data on export of capital, so capital moving out of regions. So I know Russia for a while was a real puzzle, right? They were exporting capital, and they're a
They still
relatively
do.
poor country, and
Yeah.
as countries grow, they import capital. The
Yeah.
U.S. in the late 19th century and so on, lots of capital from Britain and
Yeah.
elsewhere. So, you know, if you have regional measures of capital flows and you have regional measures of labor flows, which you might have over time and across space, that could reinforce these, you know,
Yeah.
weak institutions,
There
which is
are-
why you get that.
There are no data on the capital flows as far as I know. Now, the capital data here actually are quite poor. So it is, okay, book value of capital stock. But you can see at least the changes. There are data on labor migration and the work that's been done. There has been quite a bit of work done on migration. So first of all, so in Russia, so migration is not interregional migration is not very high. It is so despite the fact that the population distribution in the Soviet time was very much not determined by markets.
Right.
They still do not have much migration, and it's a problem because lots and lots of people live in very cold climates, and there are discussions how to bring them to more livable conditions where they don't need to be subsidized and all that, and it's been going on for a long time. But one relevant statement in that literature was that it was precisely the migration out of poor regions that was very difficult to achieve, precisely because they were poor. All right, if you are poor, you don't have the resources to pick up and go. Now, as Russia became richer during the 2000s, it seems that that problem was mitigated. At least by the end of our period, that might have been somewhat mitigated, but no, it has not become a really mobile country at all. So in one of my earlier papers, I have the data on that, a footnote about that. It's much less mobile than the U.S.
The U.S. stands out. I mean, Italy's
Well,
not very mobile,
probably.
with the South being very poor and the North rich, and people don't move. So usually the answer is, transfers keep them there.
Yes.
But one other variable, because this institutional quality is a real kind of black box, right?
Yes, it is, unfortunately, yes. I mean, it's not a black box, but it has all kinds of stuff in it.
Yeah, it has a bunch of components.
Yes.
And what you said earlier I thought was interesting, that of those components, you thought corruption was maybe the most important.
Most visible.
Yeah. But so does Transparency International have...
Oh, yeah. Oh, no. Okay, Transparency International, as far as I know, it does not rate the corruption by region.
Okay.
But there are data just for 1 year, more or less reliable data on specific kinds of corruption by or for 70 regions. But it's only for 1 year, for 2011, so it's hard to...
But it'd be interesting to correlate it just with institutional quality.
Well, yes, but again, it's only for 1 year. I would say that the main contribution of this paper to this specific literature on institutional intensity of industries and all that is panel, yes, and because again, otherwise there are at least 2 papers I know of on Chinese provinces. There is none, so in Levchenko on cross-country stuff, and And I have a paper with a former graduate student on Indian states, but all of those are essentially cross-sectional stuff. So besides the Russian angle, the contribution here is a panel analysis, and so I would like to keep it that way.
Tony, then Chuck.
Yeah. I have forgotten my question. I apologize.
I'll give you 30 seconds to remember.
I still haven't
Let me ask mine and you might remember.
Right, sorry.
So one of the things I don't see in these regressions are health statistics.
Health?
Health. I mean, to what extent can that explain why a region doesn't have more manufacturing output? Alcohol rates, age of death, hospitalization. I mean, I'll bet you got tons of stuff there.
Well, not as much as you might think, because again, these are regional data. Yes, there are data by
Alcohol's
region.
got to be regional. You got to have that.
Well, I'm not sure if these numbers are available by region. Probably, I mean, I'm sure that they exist. I'm not sure if they are publicly available. I have not seen them in sort of standard yearbooks. But there are mortality and some sort of some sort of morbidity data too. But I want to stress that this is not about manufacturing output in general. It's about manufacturing output by sector. And unless you're saying that health quality, that the quality, that the health
Yeah, I am saying. I was wondering if that's
level would be different depending on which industry you work in, on which sector. Say,
which sector.
yeah, because I mean, are healthy people more likely to work in computer industry, I mean computer making industry, or in food and beverages industry? I don't know. I have no idea about that. I mean, it would have some relationship to institutional quality, I would think, but I don't know about specific manufacturing sectors. The health data that are readily available are things like, well, number of hospital beds per person and all that, and it's not clear what to make of that in terms of what do they mean. I mean, does a region have a lot of hospital beds per person because it's a very healthy region, or because it's a very sick region?
Tony, you have your question yet?
It wasn't very good, but
It's okay.
I know
My
that-
answer won't be good
Let's
either.
decide.
yeah, I know you're using an instrument about distance to Moscow.
Yeah.
But Moscow is kind of an awkwardly placed kind of city in
Yes.
Russia. It's a big
Yes.
country, but
yes.
distance to Europe, or maybe like distance to Beijing, would that?
But those are even more awkwardly placed, right?
I know, but I'm just wondering if maybe countries that are closer to maybe the European side might have a
Yes.
European influence for regulatory
Yes,
quality.
I might look into that, but the reason that people sometimes use distance to Moscow is because in Russia it's a
Yeah.
very
I understand
centrally
that.
oriented country. If you look at the Russian railroads, it is all emanating from Moscow essentially. And quite often if you want to get from one city to another, and the cities may be relatively close by in terms of, as a bird flies, you have to go to Moscow first and then to
Yeah.
that other city. And because Moscow is such a central part of the country, the distance to Moscow is sometimes used as an indicator of something. I am not arguing that these are good instruments, the status of a republic and the distance to Moscow. They seem to be, both of them seem to be negatively related to institutional quality, at least to this index, and satisfy over-identification tests, but they could affect all kinds of stuff. So I am not arguing that these are good instruments. The only thing I'm saying is, again, in other papers in this literature, the instruments are also pretty bad. Moreover, in Nann's paper, he says outright his instruments do not satisfy over-identification restriction. And so Finster et al., they don't even give you over-identification tests. So they simply say, well, we're using, so these are instruments.
Well, that wasn't the worst question we've had, so.
Which one was?
Yeah, he's rating him.
I'm going back into the archives. Let me make a comment and maybe have a question here as well. I go back to Chuck's original point. I'm not sure what to make of the conclusions here because I don't have a good feel for what is going on in the institutional quality variable that's really making things happen. I wouldn't have minded seeing just some summary statistics and a map, see look what's going on with the different regions and so forth. Maybe you've got that hidden somewhere.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that occurred to me, everything here, I guess you want to test this relationship specificity stuff, but you're focusing on these regional sector stuff. And when I think of institution, I might think of overall output, or why aren't we looking at regional GDP or something like that?
Well, so it is part of it. I mean, again, I did not show the controls here. They are in the paper, but per capita regional product is in the paper. I mean, it's one of the controls.
I'm thinking as an outcome measure.
Oh,
Why are we looking at effective institutional quality on regional output, regional GDP?
okay. So let me try maybe to reiterate, explain in the remaining whatever per minute. The basic logic is Russia ostensibly has tried to diversify away from oil and develop its sophisticated manufacturing. Presumably they have not been able to do that because of poor institutions. How do we show it? It is not possible to show it using country-level data because, well, Russian institutions are poor, but we have only 10 points, so 10 data points and all kinds of intervening stuff. So what we are trying to show is that institutional quality within regions plays a role in developing sophisticated manufacturing sectors. And it's positively related to the development of these sophisticated manufacturing sectors. And given that the overall institutional quality in the country is fairly low and stagnant, the fact that we have been able to show that institutions matter essentially. At the regional level, well, if they matter at the regional level, you aggregate the regions, they matter at the country level. And so we exploit inter-regional variation in institutional quality to demonstrate the point about the role of institutions in the country overall. Okay, so if the institutional quality prevents development of sophisticated manufacturing sectors in regions with poor quality, it must also prevent it in the country as a whole. And I have to also mention that even though there is a fairly large variety of institutional quality, so according to this and other measures, across the Russian regions, so essentially all of them have relatively poor institutional quality. It's just that some of them are awful and some of them are not as awful. But exploiting the variability there, we can hopefully demonstrate the point that it's the country's institutions that prevent this kind of growth.
We have time for maybe one more question. Chuck, you want to fill it up? Or do you want
I got it. How
Michael
do you
to-
solve the last problem? How do you change a country's institutional
So,
quality?
So say it again, please. Oh, how do you solve it? Well, yes. No way, no how. Nobody knows.
Chuck has a technical
on
question.
that
I'll wrap it up.
GMM, do I count 150 orthogonality conditions on that?
Oh, yeah. But it's not a problem because there are many more groups. So it's a panel
How do
with...
you get more groups than Isn't the orthogonality conditions, aren't they for each region, each time?
No. The thing, what you need to happen in a system JMM is that the number of instruments, the lagged values of variables and differences,
Oh, you're lagging them.
has to be significantly smaller than the number of groups. Groups here are not regions. Groups here are region industry pairs.
Region industry pairs.
So, and there are like 1,000 some groups.
I was just wondering how that converged.
Okay, the Hansen test is nice.
Yeah. But Hansen test, it wouldn't work. So
Well,
if
if you have
the
a
number of
marginal,
instruments
yeah.
were huge, so relative to the number of groups.
Yeah, no, this one I'm saying.
Yeah. So instruments and groups, yes. Okay.
Well, we're done. Thank you, Michael.
Well, thank you very much. I have a bunch of comments. I hope that I will be able to incorporate them and, well, anyway.
Incorporate the good ones.
Yeah. Real work at home.
How you doing? Thank you.
Your call will be disconnected.